Okay. Yeah. So learning how to juggle, for example, changes the structure of the cerebellum and other parts of the brain, the motor cortex that relate to fine movement and balance. This is what I call my patronizing slide, because usually half my audience knows these things very well, but I just want to be on the safe side and all of the same page. So this is a typical brain. You cut it in half. You see some landmarks. You see that the surface of the brain is much darker than the inside of the brain, and the surface of the brain is what we call the gray matter. The inside of the brain is white matter. And you also have some gray matter modules inside the brain as well. So one is gray, one is white. What you see here is a typical neuron in the brain, right? And the typical neuron in the brain has some different components. The cell body, the part of the neuron that receives information from other neurons, it synthesizes information and produces new information to be communicated to other neurons. And this long extension, the axon, which is the main avenue by which this information gets communicated to other neurons, right? You will see that the axon is wrapped by this substance here, which we call the myelin. So the myelin is blue in this diagram, it's white in real life. So this is very unhelpful. The neuron itself is darker, it's grayish. The myelin serves as, let's say, insulation. So the same way you have casing in your cables so that the electricity does not escape in space, the same way you have myelin, so the information that's created by the neuron does not dissipate in space, right? So it's communicated effectively to the next. So once you have this information ready, you drop it down the axon, and then you have the synapse, and then you have the next neuron next to it that receives information from many neurons, and so on and so forth. So you have this recycling of neural signals. So the cell bodies are all grayish, and the axons are all white-ish. So what you see here is all the cell bodies are in symmetry to each other, which is the gray matter. So that's where all information gets processed rapidly. And you have all the axons moving away from them, provide connectivity to different parts of the brain. So that's the white matter. Okay? And the other thing to know is that the white matter myelin itself is divided by these cells here, which are called oligodendrocytes, which wrap themselves around the okay? So that's what creates the white matter. So what about experience-based neuroplasticity in general? Well, we know that when you get trained into a skill, you get better at that skill, right? If training is intensive and sustained. So as you get better in that skill, the part of the brain that processes that skill starts developing, starts to grow in volume. So at the beginning of skill acquisition, you have this growth, which is underlined by increased availability of connections between the different neurons that you have in this part of the brain. Why is that? Because you learn something new, and the brain tries to find the most efficient way, the most efficient connections to undertake this task, right? So it creates as many connections as it can until it finds the most efficient, right? So this is what you get at the beginning of position, and then, well, your behavior increases, the gray matter volume increases as well, and then you have some microstructural properties, which I won't cover in too much detail now, happening under the hood, right? So you have activation of these cells, glial cells, and you have this creation of new dendrites and synapses. So we're talking about this increased connectivity, right? But the better you become at that skill, you have a very interesting timeline of these changes. So you become better and better and better, but the gray matter volume has increased up to a certain level, then suddenly it starts decreasing again. So you have increases at the beginning of skill acquisition, followed by decreases, where you become very, very efficient in your skill. What does that mean? You've learned the skill, the brain has found the best connections to take care of this skill, But remember, it had created loads of connections until it found the best ones, right? So at this level, at the previous level, at this level now, the brain starts cutting off all these connections that are redundant because they're not needed anymore. And why are they cut off or pruned, if you want to be technical? Because they consume energy to be maintained, and the brain does not like that, right? So this is what you get in terms of brain volume changes, increases, plateauing, then decreases, and then at the microstructural level, you get different processes again that underlie this pattern. So you have rewiring, as I said, at the peak with all these connections, and then at the big efficiency, let's call it, stage, you have elimination of surplus connection, which is again underlined by activity of these astroglia and microglia cells in the brain, right? It sounds too detailed, but will become relevant later on. So that was gray matter. White matter, which is in the case of the brain, we're talking about the polydendrocytes and how they wrap themselves around the axons. We know that when you have an active axon, polydendrocytes will develop and will start wrapping themselves around the axon to make this communication more efficient. And this is a dynamic process. So let's focus on what happens over longer periods of time, right? Not just at the beginning. So this polydendrocyte here has wrapped itself on this axon and this axon. They're both active. So all the red ones are active, or the blue ones are inactive. So it has wrapped itself on both of them. Over a few days, they're still active, so you have more wrapping. The dendrocyte around the axons, increases. But then if one of them stops being active, then you see that this patch becomes smaller. So it drives back, right? Whereas this one is very active, and you have even more wrapping. So even more white matter, right? So the more active the action is, the more white matter you have. And I forgot to do my animation here, right? So this is the principle. So gray matter goes up and then down, white matter goes up and probably stays up unless you don't need that anymore, unless you start losing the skill. Yeah. So that was the background. And before we forget why we're here, let's turn back to bilingualism as a skill, as an experience. So there isn't a lot of disagreement or controversy suggesting that bilingualism is a long-term experience, which encompasses ongoing learning demands, but most importantly, ongoing control demands. Right? The more you learn in two languages, the more there is to control between these two languages. Right? The level of vocabulary, phonology, syntax, you name it. Bilinguals become better in both acquiring and controlling the languages, as long as they're active in using the languages, obviously, right? Because I learned German when I was 14 for 4 years, right? And I remember 3 words now. I'm not exactly multilingual. So if bilingualism is this cognitively challenging experience, should we expect it to affect brain structure the same way other experiences, other types of training affect brain structure? And if that's the case, where in the brain you see effects and how? Starting with probably the father of all models, we know that key regions that are involved in language processing and language control adapt in terms of their function when they're dealing with cognitive demands of bilingualism, right? So Taleb in green, it's a pity Jubin could be here today, identified some key regions related mostly to language control, like some frontal regions, the cortex, the ACC, the thalamus, the basal ganglia, some parietal regions, and the cerebellum. And they adapt their function and how strongly they connect to each other according to what sort of bilingual context you find yourself in, right? So if you are in a multi-language interaction context, you have better, more intense connectivity of all these regions that relate to control. If you are dense cultivated context, you only have strengthened of some of these connections, not everything. So there are adaptations in functional connectivity, but they depend on the context. So, are these experience-based functional adaptations accompanied by structural adaptations, right? We've seen that in other types of training, I've mentioned already. We know that brain changes in function, doesn't change its structure. Earlier studies have shown adaptations, structural adaptations, in those regions which were identified by the ACH, the adaptive control hypothesis, right? And the white matter tracts that connect these regions. So I'm presenting here a selection of those studies that focus on this particular region. So the first one, the seminal study now by McKelly in 2004, so that bilinguals have great matter density, the monolinguals, in this part of the brain, the right inferior parietal lobe, which has been linked to vocabulary acquisition. And also, the volume in this region correlates positively with proficiency in the second language. So the more proficient, the bigger the volume in this region, and also negatively to the age of acquisition that you cannot see here, in the sense that the younger the age of acquisition, the bigger. Right. So this was the first study that started it all, practically, right? Later on, other people found other things. Stein et al. In 2012 found significant correlations between gray matter volume and proficiency in the second language. In the left anterior temporal lobe, this part here. And the inferior from the gyrus, this part here. Both regions have been linked, among other things, because everything in the brain does everything, have been linked to grammatical processing. In a different study, we found that bilinguals have greater volume than monolinguals in those parts of the cerebellum, the very posterior parts of the brain, which we know is involved in like 1 million things, including grammatical processing and phonological processing. And we also found that the volume in these regions correlated negatively to their speed in performing grammatical tasks. So the bigger the cerebellum, the faster they were to do morphological processing, right?
Everybody across them?
Sorry?
Everybody across them?
It was just the bilinguals. It wasn't the monolinguals, so there was no, yeah, you just did the bilinguals. Yeah? Well, we tested it, it didn't happen. Don't have it here, but yeah. The Olulade et al. Study reported greater volumes in unimodal bilinguals and monolinguals in several classes of the brain, frontal and middle, inferior and middle frontal gyrus, both related to speech, syntax, cognitive control. The inferior parietal lobule related to attention, and the superior and middle temporal gyra, which are involved in phonology and vocabulary. So a more wide network of regions, most of them were already shown by the ACH to be important for bilingualism. The same study compared bimodal bilinguals with monolinguals, and they didn't find these effects. That's a different story. We can talk about it later. When it comes to subcortical structures, in the study from our lab, 2017, we found expansions to subcortical structures in Mexican bilinguals versus monolinguals. So, subcortical structures are these modules of gray matter that I told you are very deep inside the brain. And in this study, we found bigger thalamus, glottis phallus, and putamen for sequential bilinguals that were immersed in the UK. They've spent something like 12 or 13 years of continuous presence in the UK. They were professionals, they had to use their English as a second language. The expansion of glottis phallus specifically was those to predict the amount of immersion. So the more time they've spent in the UK, the bigger that structure was. This pattern effect was comparable to earlier findings for simultaneous bilinguals. Actually, the similarities between the two studies were scary, but very nice for this thing. In the same study, we compared sequential bilinguals of comparable proficiency, but very limited immersion in the UK. We compared them to monolinguals, and we found very, very limited effects, and all of them in the coded English, right? Structure that wasn't found to be effective in the immersed group. It will all make sense. So, what about the white matter? Increased language selection and monitoring needs better connectivity between brain regions. And so, how would this manifest in terms of increase? And we know that the more myelin, white matter, the better is the relay of information between brain regions, right? We talked about insulation of the action so that the information doesn't escape. So the more you have of it, the better the insulation. And we also know that myelin can increase as a result of training. We saw that at the beginning, right? The more intense the training, the more sustained, the more myelin you have. And you don't lose it as well, right? Because you need to keep practicing the skill. But also we know that myelin is particularly vulnerable to aging and neurodegeneration, especially in diseases like multiple sclerosis. And this is important, we'll come to that later on. So what happens to white matter? In this study by 2011, they reported increased white matter integrity for all the bilinguals compared to monolinguals in a bunch of white matter regions. So what you see up here in green is the white matter skeleton, as we call it. And what you see in red to yellow is those parts of the skeleton that have greater integrity for bilinguals versus monolinguals in their older age. These include tracts like the, I won't read them out, IFOF, SLF, and ILM, which all provide connectivity between frontal, temporal, parietal, and subcortical regions, right? So connectivity between different parts of the brain. The answer fasciculus, which also provides some connectivity on the one side of the brain only, and the corpus callosum, which is the main part of the brain, the main part of white matter that provides connectivity across the hemispheres. So for all these tracks, all the bilinguals had better integrity than all the monolinguals. What we did in 2015, we tested young bilinguals. Immersed in the UK for 13 years again, we ran pretty much the same paradigm and the same analysis. And guess what? What we found, you may be able to tell just by looking at this, very, very comparable patterns. Again, young bilinguals that were immersed in the UK had greater white matter integrity, and the same structures were compared to monolinguals. So what brings the two groups together is that they were both, in both cases, active and immersed bilinguals. So in both cases, they had constant use of both their languages, or at least constant need to suppress one of the languages speaking up. There's a problem here. The problem is that the variability in these results is huge. So up until that time, 2018, 2019, if you went through all the papers and tried to make sense of all the patterns, you couldn't make any sense, right? So there was variability in terms of location, and the reported effects had to do what affected almost all key regions for language acquisition, language processing, language control, but different regions in different studies, right? So you had frontal effects, you had parietal effects, you had temporal effects, you had subcortical effects, cerebellar effects, but not consistently across studies. The same happened with the effect of white matter tracts, which haven't really marked here, but different parts of the white matter were affected in different studies. Even more confusingly, there was variability in terms of direction of this effect. Most of studies would find increases in bilinguals compared to monolinguals, but some studies would find decreases in bilinguals compared to monolinguals, or decreases in professional bilinguals interpreters compared to multilinguals that were not interpreters, right? So when you reach that point, you either try to make sense or you just drop the whole idea, right? You decide that it's futile. Just to show you how complicated that was. So what the values amounted to was increased cortical gray matter in sequential bilinguals and trilinguals, in lifelong simultaneous older bilinguals, in adults training in L2, reduced cortical gray matter in interpreters compared to multilinguals, and in simultaneous bilingual children. That's all the cortex, the surface. The white matter and the subcortical gray matter, so the basic ganglia, about very different patterns to the cortical gray matter, but very similar patterns to each other. Right? So increased subcortical gray matter in simultaneous bilinguals, immersed sequential bilinguals, in simultaneous bilingual children, reductions in interpreters again, and in long-term immersed sequential bilinguals. And more or less the same effects for white matter. Have your brains exploded yet? Let me make it easy for you. Cortical gray matter increases were usually reported in bilinguals with limited language use or speaking experience where compared to monolinguals. Subcortical gray matter volume and white matter integrity increases were reported in experienced bilinguals, the simultaneous ones, the long-term ones, the interpreters, right? Compared to less experienced bilinguals or compared to monolinguals. Then, with the very experienced multilinguals compared to controls, you start seeing those reductions. Reductions in both cortical and subcortical gray matter, and in some cases, reduction in white matter. Right? So hopefully a pattern is emerging now. And this is what I found to be the challenge at the time, right? Does this pattern mean that these structural adaptations in individual's brain, a bilingual's brain, fluctuate over time, right? And if that's the case, what would be the expected pattern? To test the waters, here's a familiar shaven face. We did something quite crazy at the time, and it was quite difficult to fund it, but we had good colleagues in Reading. So we brought back some people from the original study, the 2015 study, and we scanned them again after 3 years of the original scanning. These people, the only thing they had done, is that they had remained in the UK for those 3 years, right? They didn't do any language training. They didn't change anything in their lives. We checked whether they started learning a third language, because that would throw a spanner in the works. They hadn't. So they were just minding their own business for 3 years, and then we went back and brought them into the scanning again, and we compared changes in the brain in 3 years. So we found structural changes continuously taking place, even in these people that didn't do any explicit training. And we found, when measured decrease in the cerebellum, contractions in the left quadrant that you cannot see there, the support structure, and also decreased frontal white matter integrity. All of these things happening within 3 years without them doing anything, right? So the only thing they did, they remained immersed in an L2 speaking environment. So, as I said, you either drop this or you try to make sense. So I chose to try to make sense. So in 2020, I came up with a model of how this change in the bilingual brain can be explained, taking a few pages of the general experience neuroplasticity, right? Which I call the Dynamic Restructuring Model, which looks like this. So I separate the bilingual experience in 3 stages, notional stages. We can discuss whether that's valid or not. But it seems like at the first stage, where you initially exposed to the language, you're exposed to an environment that makes you speak the language. You're very likely to see increases. Whoops, that went too fast. Well, whatever. You're very likely to see increases in parietal regions, temporal regions, frontal regions, and the hippocampus. All regions related to the acquisition of a language, and some of them related to language control. And also, you start seeing some effects in the cognitive nucleus, which is a cortical structure very important for cognitive control in general, and the cerebellum. The more experienced you become, you enter what I call stage 2, part of the bilingual experience, where suddenly you start seeing the disappearance of these effects, right? So now you don't get any cortical increases compared to monolinguals. Suddenly all of them disappear. But what you get in the more experienced bilinguals is all the subcortical effects, right? So the effects practically move. And this is the type of experience where you would expect to see changes in the white matter. Right, so these are all white matter tracks. The third stage, which I call the deficiency in bilingualism, is the one that's not very well specified yet, simply because we don't have a lot of evidence to take very experienced bilinguals. But a lot of this comes from interpreters, the very experienced treaters, right? So this group you see starting to see reductions again in those effects, some increase in cerebellum, and then reductions in the white matter integrity, right? These are the extremely experienced switchers. The one thing to remember, and we're focusing on this part here, right? The great amount of volume changes, is that you may get some parts of the brain start to increase with increased experience, so all the frontal parts, the parietal parts. And then with increased experience, you can see them move to this pruning, going back to baseline phase, right? The same regions. But while these regions return baseline, you may get other regions starting to increase. And this would be the supportive regions. So the effects start from all these regions related to the acquisition and control to a certain extent. And then with increased experience, they move to this part of the brain, which are key cognitive control and specifically language control. And there's good reasons to believe that these regions themselves will go through the same process. But in order to study that, we need these very, very experienced, extreme molecules. So what does this tell us? It tells us that bilingualism should be treated as an experience. And I'm probably preaching to the choir here, right? I know where I am. So there's a lot of people that have been suggesting this. We know that definitions of bilingualism have been varied and actually ignorant of the actual bilingual experience, right? A lot of us have said that. A lot of people, some of them in this room, have suggested research on bi-multilingualism should move away from comparing to the monolingual control, right? It's not informative anymore. We don't know what a monolingual control is. Why should we care? Titon and Tiv, in a very nice paper, suggest we should look at bilingualism as a different framework, right? You're in the professional level, the ecology, society, and where you find yourself, the temporal aspects of it. I won't go into detail about all these frameworks and theories. They're very interesting. I will focus on how we go about testing those things. So one of the first attempts that was done was with this pattern here. And then we treated bilingualism as a continuous factor the first time, right? So we used a questionnaire measuring, well, the LTQ, if you're familiar, measuring their engagement in L2 use in social settings, in home settings. We also measure their immersion in an L2 environment, the age of acquisition, so on and so forth. And we used all these measures as predictions of brain structure and, well, subcortical structures in this case. And we found that these experiences have personal effects on brain structure, right? So what you see in the top row is polynucleus in green, and then you find significant expansion of that polynucleus predicted by L2 social. How much you switch to your L2 language, to your second language, to social settings. In this row of brain here, you see the effects of what is it now? Immersion. So number of months spent in the UK, in several structures, including the right coded, payment, and load structure. This was a rich paper, many different patterns. And we also found effects, similar effects of bilingual experiences of brain function, both at rest and also during tasking. There was a problem in that paper, which we kind of knew at the time, we didn't work with it. We assumed that these effects were linear. Why would these effects be linear, right? There's no reason for any activation to be linear, trust me. But anyway, even my own model predicts non-linear patterns, right? So what do we do next? Try to see whether these effects are actually linear. So with my other former student in Vancouver, what we did, we tested 114 non-immersed, in this case, highly proficient circadian bilinguals, and we used GAMS, a method that's appropriate for detecting these non-linear patterns, to see how bilingual experiences affect the volume of the nucleus. So here's the nucleus, right? So what we see in this graph is the scores, bilingual experience as measured by the LSTQ, and then these are the volumes of the coded nucleus. So what you see is that at lower levels of bilingual experience, the coded is small, it gets bigger, and then at a certain point, it plateaus and has a trend of going back. Well, it didn't reach baseline, but it starts going down, right? This was cool. I was very happy because that's what my model predicted, right? Let's look at this now. So this is the same data, but we also drew age. Why did we do that? Because our sample had a big age range, 20 to 50 years old, and we know that the brain ages, right? So by aging, I mean it shrinks, pretty much. So what you see in the x-axis is again the bilingual composite score, so it's the same axis here. The y-axis height is the volumes, right? So this curve that you see here is exactly the same curve here, right? It's the same visualization out of this point. What we care about is this axis, with the younger participants towards the back and the old participants towards the front. Yeah. So the back you have the 20-year-olds, the front you have the 50-year-olds. Spoiler. So practically, these people here are 50-year-old monolinguals. These people here are 20-year-old monolinguals, right? Those are around zero. These people here are 50-year-old bilinguals, highly experienced bilinguals. And at the back, you don't see a 20-year-old highly experienced bilingual. Do you get the graph? Okay. So one thing to notice is what Amara made, right? That 20-year-old monolinguals have a volume of the coded nucleus which is comparable to 50-year-old highly experienced bilinguals, right? I don't have the exact stats to prove this, but I like the pattern, which tells me that yes, with age, the coded nucleus will drop in volume, but it will drop less in bilinguals than it will drop in monolinguals, which is a very cool finding. Very briefly, we did a very similar study, but this time we looked at Catalan Spanish bilinguals in Catalonia and immersed. So we used a different experience questionnaire, which may explain that we had some different patterns in the results. But again, we found some effects on bilingual experience, which is this axis in this case. A nice ripple here on the volume of the inferior gyrus, which wasn't quite expected. And also we found some effects in the putamen and the cerebellum. All right, so this is complicated for me. Yeah, so you have these increases with increased bilingual experience. And the putamen and the cerebellum are the ones that you would expect be bigger immersed bilinguals. So this also makes sense. And now it becomes complicated because we thought that, okay, the LSPQ is a measure of bilingual experience. Can we go into more detail about usage patterns? So we wanted to see whether the patterns of code switching use second language predict brain structure. So again, with Michal Korenar, we looked at 45 check-ins, and we used a questionnaire, we used a task that practically measures the code switching types in different environments, and also code switching types in different directions. So according to a theory, we can have for at least 4 different types of code switching, from alternation, which means that you start with L1 and then you move to L2. And this is supposed to be the one that requires the most temperature control, all the way to dense code switching, which is what you do when you throw lexis of your second glossa, and you do that without having to think about it, which requires less. So we thought that these different types of code switching may cause different effects. So we focused on quality and the thalamus, which are both structures very, very central to code control. And then we did pretty much the same thing. So we regressed the volume of these regions against its score of split. So that's splitting frequency in the different types. So what we found is more significant effects when we were switching from L1 to L2. And the switching experience affecting the volume of the code in 1, 2, 3, 4, all types of code switching, right? So the more you switched, the bigger the code practically. And some effects on thalamus as well. Switching from L2 to L1, smaller set of effects, but again, increased switching experience led to bigger volumes. And what was interesting is that the direction of switching caused different effects, right? So I've just highlighted these two. So this is the effects of alternation, frequency of alternation on the volume of the codec, both cases, but here it's alternate from L1 to L2, then from L2 to L1. So from L2 to L1, you get this non-linear effect, which I should normally be excited about, but we still try to understand what it means, right? But this is, again, a promising pattern telling us that we're still learning about these processes, right? So, as I said, I want this talk to be about what we do next. And so far, we've been looking at this part, mostly, when it comes to gray pattern, right? But as I said, there's a lot of processes that take place under the hood. So the increases in volume that you see are mean nothing unless you understand what's happening at the level of the neuron. So in a recent study, we looked at other indices of this restructuring, and specifically we looked at changes in metabolic activity in those parts of the brain that are key to language control. So you can study that by focusing on concentrations of chemicals or metabolites that their concentrations are linked to things like aging, cognitive training, and structural brain adaptations. In other words, every time you get these structural changes, you get expression of these chemicals or their concentrations change. So what do we really care about here? Well, we know that aging increases for some of these metabolites, and that's related to the action time activity. What we care about is the functional structural adaptations, which are related to training in our case, and how they change those concentrations, and whether this links to microglia activity. So the way to do this is use a specialized MRI sequence for magnetic resonance spectroscopy, or MRS. So what we did in this case, we looked at bilinguals aged 20 to 80, and we compared them to monolinguals. So what you see here is the effect of age on the concentrations of the myonocytol. And myonocytol is one of those metabolites that increases every time you get pruning, right? So every time you lose tissue, you get increases in myonocytol. Yeah. And actually, I'll tell you about. So the second one is NAA, and I said the atrophy, which works the other way. When you have decreases in volume, you also have decreases in AA. So the two chemicals work opposite ways, right? So the more you lose, the more myonocytol you have, and the more you lose, the less NAA, right? We know that these changes are triggered by aging as well. So the first thing we did is we looked at how aging patterns differ between bilinguals and monolinguals. So you have a steeper increase of minospal in bilinguals. And if you didn't know that they were bilinguals, you would say, hold on, they will age faster than monolinguals. But then we took this measurement bilingual experience again, and we saw whether this composite score, we call it, the LCQ, predicts this concentration, and it does predict them significantly, right? So a lot of this pruning is happening simply because they are bilinguals, and it's happening on top of the activity that is related to age. And the same pattern for NAA. I won't go over it again. Another avenue, another place to go is brain development. We know that brain development is continuous, is non-linear, and it varies by gray matter region and by matter structure, right? So we're talking about structural. So we know that the brain changes shape as we grow and changes shape as we age as well, right? So for example, this is the cortical gray matter, and this is the graph showing how it changes over time. So you have ages 10 to 30, and you see this downward trend, meaning the older we get, the thinner our cortex becomes. This is a very well-known developmental pattern, right? And we see that for different parts of the brain, so these are all the cortical structures we're talking about, right? Cerebellum, this pattern is different over the years. Yeah. So different speeds, different patterns, everything is different. My question is, does bilingualism interact with typical developmental pattern, right? So we have bilingualism increasing or decreasing volume. How does it interact with this over time? We try to do that. So we tested how many? 700, I think, participants, and we found that bilingualism does slow down typical cortical thinning over time. And that was in line with related regions. So we looked at the entire cortex and issues, have some examples here. So what you see here is age of the participants, and then you have the volume of the superior frontal diaphragm. Okay. So in blue, you see the monolinguals, and in red, you see the bilinguals, right? So both of them are decreasing with increasing age, which is as you would expect, but then this difference here was significant, meaning the bilinguals at the age of 20 had thicker cortex than monolinguals at the same age, right? In this case, the inferior parietal cortex, it was a bit different because they converged at some point, but for most of adolescents, this was a significant difference as well. So bilingualism does interact with development. Coming to aging. Now, I'm doing good for time? Yep, I think so. Yeah, good, thank you. So, as I said, brain changes as we develop, but also changes as we age, right? So brain volumes continue to decline in older age, not older. And we know that this decline in brain structure is commensurate with decline in functional, structural connectivity, but also decline in behavior. So that's practically the definition of aging, right? But these processes vary between individuals, and there are several mechanisms. Two main ones have been described that explain this variability. So some people may have developed what is called brain reserve. So that is long-term build-up of neural tissue. So these individuals have been involved in some sort of activities that help them build a lot of brain tissue, so they have more to lose as they age, practically. Or some people may have accumulated what's called cognitive reserve, which is practically preserved cognitive ability in case of neural loss. So some people with brain degeneration may still appear to be intact behaviorally because they make better use of whatever's left in the brain. Both reserves have been linked to cognitively enriching lifestyle. So education is one of the main ones, right? We know that education is good for your brain. And some people have linked this sort of research to things like exercise, brain training activities, gardening, you name it. Yeah. What about bilingualism? Right? And what about active, long-term bilingualism? It is a challenging experience, and it's not an optional experience, right? But surprisingly, it hasn't been one of the main focuses of this research. So you're probably familiar with this graph already. So Perrine Budalevi, 2015, suggested that lifelong usage of two or more languages leads to enhancement of executive control that we see in all bilinguals, and this may be explained in the two ways that, right? So neuroplastic changes that cause the brain reserve or neural reserve, as I call it, or better rewiring, better structure of spare tissue in the brain that leads to neural compensation, which is the same thing as the cognitive reserve I was talking about. So we've done some work on this. Another familiar face here. Same facial hair in this case. So in 2022, we compared all the reverse bilinguals to monolinguals, and we found that they had a larger hippocampus. So the hippocampus is this part of the brain that's important for vocabulary acquisition or encoding of memories in general, but it's also the first one to be targeted by Alzheimer's disease. No. So we found that bilinguals are this side of the graph, where overall bigger volumes than monolinguals, this side of the graph. And then we measured their bilingual experiences. We even measured the bilingual experiences of the monolinguals, because what is a monolingual, right? And some of them gave us surprising answers, right? So most of them are below 0, but then some of them had experience that is up here. So you are kind of a bilingual, right? But anyway, we found the bilingual experience did predict the volumes of the hippocampus bilaterally. In a subsequent study, we looked at patients with mild cognitive impairment. So this is a condition that is a precursor to Alzheimer's disease, right? And again, we focused on the hippocampus because it's one of the structures you'd expect to see pathology in MCI, especially Alzheimer's disease. So in this case, we have 40 Alzheimer's patients with MCI. 40 doesn't sound like a big number when you're talking about patients with life present. And we measure their bilingual experience as a measure of language entropy, which is a newer way of measuring bilingual experience, taking into account social experience of the bilingual. And we found only an effect on hippocampal volumes. So you're already familiar with these graphs. We have bilingual experience in this axis, and then we have hippocampal volume in this axis. So you see, again, we have a very nice non-linear pattern. So at low levels of experience, hippocampus is quite small. At high levels, it becomes bigger, and then it drops again at very high levels of bilingual experience. So again, a non-linear pattern. This graph was created an hour ago, and we're both very proud of it. All of us are very proud of it. And similar to what I showed you before, what it is, right? So this curve you see here is the same curve here. Yeah, but now we've thrown age in. So these are the bilinguals with, well, these are the most experienced bilinguals, right? And then we show that this curve is independent of the effects of age, which go like this, right? So this is what we can expect. 65 to 80, the volume drops. But the effects of bilingualism are independent of this. Staying on to the thing and to the face, we want to see whether bilingualism can be a more generalized protective factor in progressive neurodegeneration. And we want to say that simply because if you have been paying attention and remember the regions we talked about, the hippocampus, the basal ganglia, the frontal white matter, these are exactly the same regions that are targeted by neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's, Huntington's, and multiple sclerosis. So the same way we want to see whether development interacts, sorry, bilingualism interacts with development, we want to see whether bilingualism interacts with pathology. Very, very small amount of evidence exists. I will invite you to read this paper because it's a very long and interesting paper. I will focus here on multiple sclerosis. So we had a study that shows some compensatory plasticity for L2 learning in patients with multiple sclerosis. We don't have anything on white matter, which would have been interesting to see, but we have a behavioral study, which I'm only mentioning because I was involved. And we found that bilingual patients with multiple sclerosis did not differ to bilingual controls when it came to the monitoring cost they experienced in the Flanders task, right? You are probably familiar with the Flanders task. So it can be quite taxing. And we found that bilingual patients and controls did not differ, whereas monolingual patients were worse than monolingual controls in this task, right? So that was interpreted as evidence for some sort of cognitive reserve for bilingual patients with multiple sclerosis. Shameless plug, if you're interested in more about bilingualism and the decline in brain, we published a special issue a couple of years ago, a year ago, actually, right? So you can refer to this. Almost there. Where to go next? What I find interesting and what I find that the field needs to go to is different flavors of dual or multiple language use, because these different flavors might encompass different control needs and as a result, different patterns of brain restructuring, right? Focusing on things like multilingualism, which people have conveniently tried to ignore in this literature, largely. Diglossia, bidialectalism, bimodal bilingualism. There is work on bimodal bilingualism, I have to be fair. Caritas bilingualism, biliteracy, linguistic distance, so on and so forth, right? So, I will focus on multilingualism because we have some recent data on it. Does additional language learning come with additional demands for cognitive control? Right? So if you're juggling between 3 languages, in active environments, they use the 3 languages, right? Or 4 languages. Does it mean you have more control demands to tackle? And does that translate into different effects on the brain in additional brain restructuring? Existing evidence remains limited. We have 3 or 4 studies available. So broadly, help report very much density for multilinguals and bilinguals in the IPL. So that's one of the key regions we saw at the beginning. In the Kaiser study, they compared simultaneous bilinguals that learned a 3rd language in later life. So that's sequential trilinguals, practically. That's not the sequential trilinguals. So these are simultaneous bilinguals with 3rd language later on. 2 sequential trilinguals, so people that learn 2 languages later in life. I'm not quite sure which one is best described as sequential trilingual, but both can be, right? Thank you. Thank you, Thomas. And they reported greater gray matter volume several weeks for the 2nd week, right? And there are cortical effects. And if you see them through the prism of the dynamic restructuring model, it actually makes sense because these are the same regions starting over the acquisition and control of an additional language. In a more recent study with another pharmaceutical mind, we compare mono-bilingual with quadrilinguals, right? So the quadrilinguals and the trilinguals were Malaysia, which is a place where active multilingualism is actually practiced. And we kind of use number of languages spoken as an index of multilingual experience. I know what the objections are. I have the same objections, but you have to start somewhere, right? I wish we had a good questionnaire, but we didn't have a good questionnaire in this study. What we found was non-linear restructuring of putamen and the globus pallidus with increasing experience. So what you see in this graph is the putamen as a cortical structure linked to articulation. So monolinguals, bilinguals, trilinguals, quadrilinguals, left hemisphere and right hemisphere. Yeah. So you see that when you speak two languages, you have bigger payment than which is more than the same when you speak three, but when you speak four, it starts dropping. Yeah. So a nice non-linear effect. The same for globus pallidus, which has functions which are very, very similar to the cutaneous. For the common nucleus, we found a flat effect. Only the quadrilinguals had bigger coded nuclei than the other three groups. We interpreted that as making sense, actually, because the coded nucleus is a structure, the supportive structure that is expected to renormalize before everything else, right? So it's the first one to return to baseline. So these two, called the payment, are neighboring structures, but we know that they are affected differently by the bilingual experience. Finally, my new project is by dialectalism and diglossia, especially diglossia. So these are very particular linguistic situations that, well, they do encompass dual language use. They're quite common, but they're also quite understudied for various reasons. People don't know what bidialectalism means, or they don't know how to approach it, so on and so forth. I mean, we can talk about that, Jason, hours, suppose, right? However, there are good candidates for a single language context, as it is defined by the adaptive control hypothesis. So single language contexts, according to this model, are those contexts that you strictly use your L1 in this situation and L2 in that situation, right? So you have very limited opportunities of mixing them, code switching them, changing between them. So I think that these situations, in particular diglossia, can tell us something about bilingualism in general, because single language contexts will have very, very specific controlling needs, right? So in this paper, we reviewed the available evidence on cognitive, on behavioral studies only. There's nothing on brain instruction. And we followed up with a pair of studies looking at the effects of diglossia in both young and old diglossics. To give you some context, this is diglossia in Saudi Arabia. And if you're familiar with the Arab-speaking world, there's the Modestan Arabic, which is mandatory in education and also in all official documents and everything. And there are the local varieties that people speak. But you don't really use your local variety at educational level, right? It's socially stigmatized, it's not formal enough, blah, blah, blah. So diglossia is interesting because it's a very good example of single language context. Standard Arabic for formal purposes, local Arabic at home, and that's it. Yeah, which means that it requires a great deal of inhibitory control. You need to be very, very efficient when you inhibit the non-target language because of the social norms that will not allow you to speak the local language at the Ministry of something, right? So we gave them a few tasks. We found effects in the flanker task only for the older diglossics when compared to monolinguals, right? So young diglossics did not show any benefits and improved performance in any of the tasks that we gave them. All the diglossics showed better performance in the flanker task, so the comparison between congruent and incongruent conditions. So the flanker effect here was smaller compared to both bilinguals and also monolinguals. So there was a diglossic advantage in all the diglossics compared to monolinguals, but also compared to bilinguals of the same age, right? If that rings a bell, this is what has been reported in bilingualism as well, right? So you get these bilingual advantages in all the bilinguals, but not the younger bilinguals, right? So this is what's called the cognitive peak hypothesis, that the younger participants cannot get any better because they are bilinguals. And these behavioral effects are more likely to appear later on in life. And the observed pattern, the fact that we find this in the flanker task and not in the switch task that we use, tells us something about the effect of diglossia on the most important mechanism in diglossic environments, which is inhibitory control.
Chris, can I ask a quick
Yeah.
clarification. Who are the monolinguals in the bilingual?
Oh, that's a very nice discussion. So the monolinguals were people in the UK who were monolinguals, and the bilinguals were also people in the UK that were English, well, some English bilinguals. Simply because you cannot find those in Saudi Arabia. Yeah. So we're almost done. Bilingualism does affect brain structure. I don't think there's any doubt about it anymore. And that's probably through excessive taxing of brain regions undertaking language acquisition, language processing, and control. And these effects are related to adaptations of brain function and behavior, but we don't know exactly how brain structure relates to brain function. Such effects are tightly linked to individual experiences, and that includes sustained usage of more than one language, right? So we could say that active bilingualism is akin to this other type of skill acquisition, right? Long-term acquisition and maintenance of complex and cognitively challenging skills. The main difference that we need to keep in mind is that bilingualism is not a leisure activity. It's not something that you do in your free time simply because somebody told you learn languages because it's good for your brain. If you're an active bilingual, you have to use effective language, right? And you're usually an active bilingual in immersive environment. So long-term active engagement in bilingualism contributes to better preserve brain tissue in healthy aging, aka a brain reserve, as we defined it, and it may lead to more efficient spare tissue when you are facing neurodegeneration or a cognitive reserve. And I think the take-home message is, despite all this, richness of information, this is just the beginning. We still know very, very little about these mechanisms, the patterns, and what comes under the hood, really, and in different groups with different experiences. So I think we just started, and that's it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Christos. That's a lot of information. It's
Sorry.
quite a lot. I'm sure there's a lot for discussions. Yeah. Any questions? Yours?
First one question with Chris.
Okay.
What then about bilingualism? So I wonder, I really like the model behind it.
Yep.
So could you see those 3 stages in any time? And 3 is language switching, and that's a very immediate or I mean, I think the model is like cortical,
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's
So what was the first one?
First one is that in fact 11 is
Yes, the answer is yes. So I don't know whether you could easily define them, separate the experience into 3 stages as I did, which was a convention, was my decision. But the overall pattern of increase, decrease for gray matter and then continuous increases for white matter, I practically stole the idea from general skill acquisition literature, right? So I tried to apply to bilingual experience. The second one was about L1 acquisition.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. And then the third one is like, I guess
because I don't know, because I need to think about it, but L2 acquisition happens on top of something that's already there most of the time. But L1 acquisition, possibly. Okay, that's something to think about.
Yeah. No, so the third question is like the models I was explaining was like language competition, switching, controlling, taking one language down. That is the exercise that is in the brain. But then I feel like in no arguments necessarily an important ingredient. You could get everything you say basically from learning new skills and maintaining those skills.
But even in bilingualism, what is learned is the skill of controlling languages. right?
Once you learn new words
Mhm.
and structure,
Yes, but if you're in an active environment, there's competition, so you need to use them selectively, right?
it would be better to select words.
That's true. That's true. Okay.
So yeah, I realize one. Are we sure that the control, keeping one language is really what it's
So the way to test this is to find a situation when you only learn vocabulary.
Yeah, that's because like the openness, the music nerd go back and is that the
Possibly, I don't know. I mean, what I know is that there are some training studies that taught people vocabulary only. So there was pre-post scanning in them, and there were increases that were very, very specialized on the hippocampus, right? So the structure that's involved in vocabulary learning. And I don't remember there were any effects in subcortical structures.
What I can think of by a group in Sweden that looks
Yeah.
at this, basically doing a Duolingo type thing where you're not really engaging with control mechanisms the same way. They didn't actually see any relationship between proficiency, like the test scores, if you will, at the end of this. It found that the amount of time they spent engaging, even with the process, is what really was predictive of volumetric change. I don't think that answers your question entirely, but hopefully kind of emphasizes the situation.
But any changes will relate to what you do, what your skill, your exercise, and if there's no controlling needs, maybe you don't those things. If it's just vocabulary you acquire, maybe you do get some effects in those parts of the brain that do vocabulary acquisition, but that's it. Yeah, that's a working hypothesis. Yeah, that's a valid hypothesis. Yes. So yeah.
Can you?
Question regarding the nonlinear relationship,
Yep.
which here that leads into contexts in with age, one, and the other was with a number of languages, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 4.
Yeah.
Right. So the first question would be whether it could be in any way influenced by sample size, please. So different sample sizes. Is that a possibility at all?
Which study are you?
In any of these nonlinear relationships,
Yeah.
Perhaps there were fewer participants in the older area, something like that.
Well, it's prone to that the same way any sort of analysis is, right? So whether we had fewer participants, so whether this effect was driven by few participants, that's what you're asking, practically, right? I don't remember. Do you remember, Thomas? Especially for the MCI paper.
Well, that's all.
Well, that was, yeah, because that's what he was asking. We had a smaller sample.
Well, it's more across these levels, across the age range, and in the other context, across the number of languages.
Yeah.
Because effect sizes are very strongly affected by sample size. So that would be.
Well, so here the nonlinear effect is not a statistical effect, it's an observation, right? So I'm just telling you the pairwise differences between each of the groups, right? So these were, all of the groups had the same number of participants in this case. Yep. So yeah, that's not a regression the same way the other one was, if that's what you're asking. Yeah.
And then what's the explanation? Assuming that in this case, for instance, where that is not influenced by different advertising, what theoretical explanation would you say? What would explain, for instance, because it is quite interesting that.
Yeah. So the assumption, because it is an assumption, is that the Malays, which are the tri and quadrilinguals, simply because they live in Malaysia, which is very, very multilingual, they spend a lot of time switching and inhibiting languages, right? So they're more experienced in these tasks compared to bilinguals, which were Czechs in this time, in this case, Czechia. Because this is an assumption, so the more language you have to control, the more efficient the system becomes, right?
So why does it pick up 2 and 3 and then goes down at 4? That's my question. Let's see.
Okay, maybe, so this is a putamen, which is similar pattern to this one, right? So you start with limited experience or no experience of between languages, which is monolingual, let's say, right? And then with increased experience, you get this non-linear effect. So in the multilingualism study, as I did this assumption, I'm clear about this, is that as the languages increase, so does the experience increase. So you reach this plateau, and then with even more experience, the initial increases that you get in order to better the task start the pruning process and they go backwards, right? So try to see this as a parallel, but as I'm saying, I'm more confident in this pattern, in explaining this pattern this way than the multilingualism study. Yeah.
Okay, then Julia, and then we have a question from the chat, and then okay, yeah, Julia.
All right, yeah, everything started on okay. And a follow-up on this is that do we predict this pattern to be more complex if we want to take into account bilingual experience in more detail? For example, looking at different climate, we engage more, maybe you start more balanced, and then you engage more in one language than the other within China.
Probably, but what we lack to say this is proper longitudinal studies within the individual. So you can see how these things work over time. None of this stuff is longitudinal, unfortunately. Yeah, not yet. Yeah, if I can fund this, I'll do it tomorrow. I need a big group followed over many years practically to do that.
But it's nice to see studies with children of different ages.
Yeah. Thank you.
There's a question from chat.
Yeah.
From Ludo.
Oh, okay.
And she says, thank you, Christos. Do you still think there's a place for bilingual, multilingual, monolingual comparisons? Or should we just focus on predictors of brain differences then by multilingual?
Well, I think you know the answer to that already. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of discussion of what's the point of using the multilingual baseline anymore, right? Especially when you look at these sort of effects on brain structure. I mean, you assume that a monolingual is a monolingual, which is not necessarily the case, and you assume that the monolingual brain structure is static and is not itself affected by other things. So yes, my answer is let's look into the groups, right? If that's her question, right? Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Julian, you answer no.
We should move away from the between groups comparisons.
Question on the summary.
Yeah.
Picture. So I guess what I love to tackle was how much of the effect we're seeing and the advantage is really down to long-term bilingualism, and how much of the effect can you, or the advantages are about current habitus and or training in a current, say, learning a new language. Because I got from the talk yesterday that a lot of these striking effects can be achieved also with just starting to learn a new language or learning to dance, whatever.
Yep.
And then some of your biggest effects actually were between populations who were at present having a different experience. So I wonder, I was trying to disentangle, but at some point you did claim long-term bilingualism as affecting the brain. I just saw your current multilingual experience having effects on the brain.
Right, okay. So this is a question of how you report your bilingual experience. And the problem we have, the reality we face with these studies is that people normally report their experience here and now, right? We very rarely have an index of, well, you've been bilingual for 30 years. Were you more active 20 years ago than what you are now? So we don't have a very good way of studying this. So I suspect what Jubin talked about yesterday was these training studies that happen. So yeah, dancing and you know, painting and bilingualism as well. And yes, there are some effects, but as I said, these tend to be of the type of effects that you see in the cortex in the part that relates to this initial acquisition of a skill, right? So there is the issue of timing, but there's the issue of location. Yes, you can have effects quite quickly. In the language acquisition studies, you find effects after 3 months or 4 months or something. And there is even a study that shows some effects in the white matter vocabulary acquisition within 4 hours, which is scary, right? But these may be the same regions that if you keep on doing this, will renormalize after a few years. So how you disentangle the time and the trajectory of this, it is a challenge. But we have to keep in mind that different regions will be affected at different stages or with different levels of experience.
Thank you so much also for the lecture part where you talked about just general changes for the feel like that is interesting. Talking about like unilingualism, and you just mentioned vocabulary teaching. What is vocabulary teaching in a different language?
Yeah.
Because I did have also somebody asked the question similar to what John asked about what about people who just reach vocabulary within one language? So imagine this.
People reach vocabulary?
Reach vocabulary in the same language.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, so imagine that if you teach people a difficult word, they go for like a theory exam kind of for US, for example. Would you expect to find the same changes in similar brain regions?
Well, there is at least one study that I can think of that correlated vocabulary size to the volume of the hippocampus in monolinguals, and that was 2009. So there may be a relationship, but there was nothing dynamic about it, right? So it didn't tell you whether it's happened over longer periods of time. I don't remember if these people got special training to increase the vocabulary. I have to say I don't remember that. What was the question?
If you teach people.
If you teach people, yeah.
No.
Possibly, you may get the same effects of vocabulary acquisition even if you're L1, because at the end of the day, vocabulary is vocabulary. So if it's a word that you don't know and you learn, does the brain know whether that's L1 or L2 when it acquires the word? I don't know. Very interesting questions. Say it, James.
So can I just make a comment? And I think you know what asked. I think it's the second part of it. It's really interesting, right? And I think that it's a common question or a common thought, right? Which is, well, so what is the specificity of the domain specificity by the movement itself, right? So the question that you ask is a really logical question, but I think you probably also have the information that it's not an answer on two axes. The first one is, to ask that question, we would have to know what would happen without language in the first place. So we don't have a problem placebo to have the absence of language in the first place. So to need to answer your question, is this any better than above and beyond what we expected now on? If you take the default, and none of us like this, but let's for a second take monolingualism as a default case, because it's not different. Bilingualism subsumes the first language, but not vice versa. So that's why just for a second I'm going to take it as the default. in order to answer that question, because all these other things are happening to your brain at the same time that are not language, we would need to know what happens on the basis of language in the first place. So to answer that, we also have to have a problem comparison, and that would have to be languageless people to L1. And then above and beyond what we see in bilingual. But the real question, I think here's where you do have, and this relates to Ludo's question, there is some functionality to, let's say, a monolingual to a bilingual control, specifically if you're interested in that question. I think we're not necessarily interested in that question, so therefore we don't need that control. But here, the question that we're all interested in, at least the field primarily was, above and beyond that which, because bilinguals also have. So the question here is, when you have more language, in this case, we're going to mark them by 2 different codes that we're going to call 2 different languages. What above and beyond is happening in the same domain? So in a sense, the mechanisms can be the same, and nobody's ever suggested that bilingualism has a completely separate mechanism by which something happens. It relates to your third part, I know, which is it control? I get that. But to the second part of the question is, is it likely that children go through these sets of things? Well, potentially, because at some point it's just learned, and it's learned as something. The question becomes then, what is above and beyond that which happens because now we're in the domain of language, or we can add another language to it. And then the extra question becomes, well, what is the mechanism related to bilingualism that might give rise to cognitive and brain structure fungibility? One thing that I think is important within the research that has shown really nicely is that over time, when learning is no longer taking place, when linguistic acquisition is no longer taking place, he's very nicely showing how the brain does not stay static to that things are happening. So maybe it's not control, but something else related to bilingualism is taking care of the shifting of this after acquisition has plateaued, maybe not to perfection of proficiency that you compare to a monolingual, but at some point in immersion, so lots of these studies with Vince, we've all done together, these people are not learning. In fact, he didn't tell us, but in that follow-up study in 2018 or 2019, their proficiency does not change. So between the spans of the 3 years, we did the same proficiency measure. So from the measure we have, they have plateaued between these 3 years of proficiency, but there are structural changes. So something has to be there that's driving that change after learning is no longer taking place, if it is all related to the domain of language and not some spurious difference that's true of all our species, but that's the one.
Well, I mean, I think that goes back to, sorry.
So how can we control the state aspects?
Yes. So
well, there's a social aspect that comes along, well, right? I mean, I've always been a little skeptical to the sort of switching that is sort of taxing in itself, because it's hard to speak, right? I mean, the shifting between languages isn't necessarily hard and shifting between words or context, whatever, right? So that's why I always thought, like, I mean, that's why I would like to see that an increased lexicon of richer social life. Is that all we need, or do we need a mechanism of, say, language competition to explain these things?
well, yeah, I still believe we need a mechanism of competition, right? Because, and you see that in immersion, it's competition is more difficult to tackle when you become immersed, and then over the years it becomes an easier task to handle, right? So this should be underlined by changes. So it shouldn't just be vocabulary, increases of vocabulary. I don't know if I'm answering the question really, or if I understand the question.
I think of less, well, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
Be quiet if it's not.
Yeah.
What I think impossible is that an eventual explanation, if it's a genuine phenomenon. First one is that an eventual explanation does not involve something that is bilingual centric to the context of bilingualism. It might be something else that happens as a result, and a need that emerges, maybe one that we're not thinking of, maybe a portion that emerges related to the usage, because these are all correlated very nicely. In the past 5 years, I mean, there's not just our group study, many other group studies, showing that there's something that's related to the different moving parts, but not control. I don't think we have a good hypothesis of what we, because we have an observation, we need something, whatever it might be, to explain it, and that's the hypothesis is kind of control, right? So, you know, we also know there's other proxies, right? So again, to your point, what is education? Education is often measured in education studies by vocabulary size knowledge, right? That, or beyond attainment and things, you can say this person went to college, this person whatever. So when we think about the commonalities of other things, it's probable, it is the case that people are more educated, who then potentially have more refined language skills. But in that context, it might just be a symptom of the education itself. What are these things proxies for? Here, I think there is a nice isolation between everybody has language, so keeping that constant, right? There's no placebo for us to devoid something of language. But now we could probably do much better in controlling for things where we're making these types of comparisons. We want to say we want to walk away from the question we're really concerned in. We want to walk away from that comparison to monolingual and bilingual because bilinguals are not the same. Either. So let's regress out and get the largest numbers to kind of see. And the patterns are there and they're consistently there. So if not control, okay, but it's going to have to be something that differentiates between what traditionally is more on the scale of monolinguals to bilingualism.
All right, so we are actually running a little over. There's one more question. Well, not a question, but more of a and I'm very sorry that Jojo just left because Garrett, our colleague from psychology, she's saying, building on Yelina's question, she's heard that the Chinese learn over their lifetime more and more words, how to write them, you know, with that comes usage, and you can see that with corresponding changes in the brain as well. So, yeah, that's just a comment from Garrett for the you know, do learning more words in your L1 would also refer to changes. So you know that's not something that I'm aware of, but you know.
What changes are there?
Good question.
Where?
Yeah, Garrett, if you were there, would you?
I mean, that's the key thing also to say, to highlight those subscribers, that these changes are not random. They are exactly where executive control and language control overlap. They're just not random. Yeah. And that's learning graphic, so
that's what I'm asking.
Some of these studies, because it's in the visual cortex.
Yes, it's that's why I'm asking. So you can expect changes in the
learning the fourth gives you something. The question is the specificity of where and what I'm talking. But yeah.
All right. Well, with that said, our time in this room at least is over. We will continue our gathering. We can continue our discussion. So there's a small reception out in the mezzanine area upstairs, and following that, there's a pop-up tonight at Khadijah's place from 6 p.m. onwards. I think. Sadly, Khadijah's not here anymore to confirm that. But yeah, pop-up at Khadijah's place tonight. Everyone's welcome. And yeah, shall we wrap it up and give Christos one last round of applause?
Thank you. I switched it off.
There's no mute.
Yeah, I think that's what I did. Yeah.
Oh.
Was it a lot?
It really was.